Well, thank you so much for coming, and I also want to express my appreciation for everybody at the Crystal Bridges Museum. I think that the exhibition's state of the art really stands as a challenge and a proposition to curators everywhere. Everything about the way that Don and Chad and everyone at the museum have put together this show it really breaks the mold on how exhibitions are typically done. And as an artist, it's been really exciting to be a part of this process. Some of the programming that the museum has done around the show has had a real impact on me and an impact on my work, some of which I'll talk about tonight. So before I get into talking about individual pieces, what I'd like to do is to give you a deeper kind of personal context for understanding how what I make relates to who I am. So what I'll be doing is projecting images of my work, and as I get some of that foundation set, I'll then talk about individual pieces. So one of the things that came up in conversation when I was at the museum last month and participating with a artist panel, we were talking about the changing role of the artist studio in contemporary artistic practice. And you could say that we're in a post-studio moment. But for me, the studio is very central to what I do. I think that some of the sort of rethinking about the role of the artist studio in the past has been a kind of response to an over-dramatized or over-romanticized notion of a kind of artist working. And I think that a lot of that overturning of this old paradigm has been progress. But for me, I do think of my time in the studio as a somewhat romantic time, even as it is a daily practice. I'm in my studio 7 days a week. It is an example of a kind of self-discipline, and it's at times quite tedious. But the truth is that I have an emotional range of experience in the studio that I don't have anywhere else. And I think about the studio as a kind of external brain. It really is the central processing of my life. So any kind of insight or wisdom that I have gained as I've grown up really comes through the studio. So one of the ways that I have been thinking about my work differently, having been here last month, is I use myself as my subject. My works are self-portraits, so they are a vision of the artist. And I've been thinking since I came back about the invented landscapes of my work as a kind of metaphoric studio. So this is a new thought for me. I've always wanted to be an artist. It's really the only thing I've ever considered doing. As a child, I loved coloring. I loved coloring books. When I went to school, the thing that I got most excited about was learning handwriting. I was quite obsessed with cursive writing. So anything that had to do with marking a page, that's really what would keep my attention. And I think it was from those activities that I came to understand myself as an artist. There's an idea out there that for somebody to decide to do something, they have to see somebody who looks like them doing that thing. But I think that for me, as a young person, I had a very simple division of the world. There were children and there were adults, and I think that was my way of understanding things. I think that a lot of things started to change for me around the age of 10. A lot of things happened that year. My family moved. We went to India for the first time. And I would say that what I'll call a process of racialization had fully started to take place in my understanding of the world. Kind of all happened at about that age. And I think it was around that time that I started to understand myself as different. So I'm African American on my mother's side. My mother grew up in Cincinnati. And I'm Indian on my father's side. My dad grew up in New Delhi. And he came to the US in his 20s for graduate school. So my parents met at the University of Cincinnati, and they've been married for over 45 years. And I also have an older sister. So I grew up in a predominantly white, upper middle class town, and probably the most sort of culturally explicit aspect of my at-school environment, the environment of my classmates, was attending my classmates' bar and bat mitzvahs. And then outside of school, my family socialized almost exclusively with a tight-knit Indian community, comprised mostly of first-generation Indian immigrants and their children. And the older generation of that community, for me and my sister, they're all aunties and uncles. And our generation, they're all, in a sense, cousins. So there's a sort of, metaphoric extended family. And I didn't grow up with any sense of belonging to a Black community. And I think that there's a sort of convergence of elements that led me feeling that I never quite fit in, that there was a sort of lack of fit in the various communities that I might feel a part of. I think that, there's a convergence of a sort of negative history, this history of the one-drop law, this idea that if you're at all Black, you're all Black, converging with this positive response to that history, this idea, of a pride, Black pride and pride of belonging to this community. And I think these things come together to create in our culture Black as a totalizing identity. So much so that to be Black and to claim any other identity can be seen as a betrayal. And I also think that in the Indian community, there is a color consciousness, a kind of, ascribing of status based on skin lightness or skin darkness. So I think that these are some of the ways that our frameworks of race made for an environment for me growing up where I felt a kind of lack of belonging or sort of misfit. Another sense of identity for me is that I think of myself as introverted, and it's kind of related to what I was saying about the studio, that my way of processing the world really is a deeply private and internal process. So in the past several years, as my work has converged around certain ideas and certain methods, I've used the term automythography to describe my work as an artist. And I think that automythography really combines both my experience of being culturally mixed as well as my sense of myself as an introvert. So in my 20s, I read Audre Lorde's 1982 book titled Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, which Audre Lorde refers to as a biomythography. And in that book, Lorde diverges from and adds to the tradition of the memoir. Lorde was the child of Caribbean immigrants, and she describes herself as a Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet. So Lorde's form of biography includes additions of fiction, poetry, and an expansive notion of telling one's story. And I think that there were a number of things that I really spoke to me about the book. Lorde describes her relationship to her parents' nation of origin, that in her household, she was surrounded by the foods and customs and objects of this other place. And yet she felt also kind of distant from this place, and that it created in her a kind of longing. And I think that I felt that way in my relationship to India. And then also, her book gave me a window into a culturally Black social sphere, which was another thing that I'd felt, I think, a kind of longing for. I also think that Lord's identity as queer and my understanding of myself as being culturally mixed gave me this sense of a kind of parallel outsiderness. So it wasn't until several years after I read Zami that I started to use a variation of Audre Lorde's term as my own. So the way that I define automythography is as a process of identity formation in which nature, culture, and self-invention merge. So automythography is my response to the limiting frameworks of race. And it's an expansive process of self-construction and self-representation, a form through which I gain and I enact my agency. So in order to give you a sense of how I put this idea into practice, I'm going to take you through my process. So this is an example of some of the source material that I make. When I have an idea for a work, I begin by thinking about what kind of gesture or posture might embody this idea. So I typically begin with a sense of the figure. And I think about this as the biographical component of automythography. So it's when I put my physical presence into the work. And I take many photographs. This is just one example. I think about this as a form of solo performances in front of the camera. Because even though I have an idea of what I am going for, I experiment within a range of movement. And because I'm, in controlling the camera from in front of the camera, there's often this kind of gap between what I think is happening and what is actually happening. And I try to expand that gap. And sometimes what I end up with is far more interesting than what I had in mind. So it's then in my preliminary drawing stage that I transform that source material so I can take this idea of carrying a weight that I represent in the studio with a pile of books and convert it into a kind of fantastical element where she's carrying her own house. So this work is part of a triptych. This is the final panel in the triptych. And the title here, this is the first panel in the triptych. The title here is a variation, again, of this word automythography. So here, autocartography, mapping the self. So this work was in part about my moving. I've lived in a lot of different places. I grew up in Connecticut. I went to school in Massachusetts. I went to graduate school in Chicago, did a residency in Houston, New York, Baltimore. And this building on the upper right there is a representation of the first home that I lived in Baltimore as an artist in residence at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And I'm representing the building here in a way reminiscent of a Mughal manuscript. So what you're seeing is the interior and the exterior of the building at the same time, and it's as if the building is kind of opening up. You can see that I'm including a lot of different textures and patterns. This is a detail of that reclining figure, including handwriting. And the text really is just a stream of consciousness, but I'm using it as another texture in the work. And this is the second panel in the triptych. So the work is, I think about the work as being about my own move and also embodying an idea of cultural migration. So I was inspired by ancient pictures of traveling processions, for example, in Chinese scrolls. And in those early works, you'll typically see a privileged class carried by a servant class. Here, I'm representing my subject in both the carried and the attendant figures. So thinking about my subject as self-sufficient. And again, this is the final panel of the triptych, and the narrative moves from right to left. So here I'm picturing myself doing part of my process and using one of the main tools that I use for making this work. I refer to those works as collage drawings. And one of the primary tools I use are Indian textile printing blocks. I start with relatively small pieces of paper. I then rip those papers apart and collage them together to create this larger drawing surface. So I'm using here Indian textile printing blocks, letterpress type, rollers, anything that can give me a different kind of mark than I get with my, with a hand drawing. And I'm thinking about this ground, this starting place, as a kind of cultural ground, because the elements that I'm using are crossing time and crossing geography. So what I'm doing at this point is I have my source material, I have my preliminary drawings, and I have this surface that has a lot of visual material and activity already on it. So my task then is to merge that planned imagery with this surface. And it's really that push-pull. What I'm doing is drawing that imagery into this surface and drawing the surface into that imagery. And it's that push-pull that creates the visual dynamics of that work. So this triptych is an example of my use of automythography. It combines self-portraiture with an expansive, imaginative space that includes both real and fantastical elements, and that those elements are drawn both from my cultural heritage and from my daily life. And so it's through this whole process, my solo performances in front of the camera, the preliminary drawings in which I transform that source material, the construction of that culturally inscribed ground, and then the making of the finished works that I'm enacting automythography. So it's how I'm putting this concept into material form. So this is one of the works in the Crystal Bridges state-of-the-art exhibition. And in some ways, it's a return to some imagery that I was working on in an earlier piece. This was a painting I made in 2005 for an exhibition at the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. I was living in Chicago at the time, and the museum had an exhibition series that was devoted to emerging Chicago artists. And this really was the first kind of professional experience that I had as an artist. There were two primary sources of inspiration for me in making the work for that exhibition. One was a 15th century illustrated manuscript from India called the Hamzanama, and it was commissioned by the then teenaged Emperor Akbar. And the other primary source of inspiration was the Victorian children's stories by Rudyard Kipling, The Jungle Book, which I had grown up familiar with in a general sense of the Jungle Book. But a year prior to the exhibition at the MCA, I found the book on the discard table at the library, and I really fell in love with it. I felt like the story was a kind of allegorical parallel to my own experience, this idea of Mowgli having this kind of complex identity. So I titled the exhibition Dancing on the Hide of Shere Khan, which is a reference to the Jungle Book. Shere Khan is the tiger that Mowgli kills. And here, Boogie Woogie refers back again to this idea of the dance. And in Mokunama, then, you can see this referring back to the source material, the Hamzanama. So Hamzanama meaning the story or the book of Hamza. Here, Mokunama meaning the story or the book of Moku. And Moku is my dad's nickname for me. And you can also see that I'm still interested in different ideas from Indian painting. So I'm thinking here about Indian miniature painting where there's a kind of density of visual material, a sort of patterning that creates an all-over visual effect. So typically in Indian painting, pattern follows form. So you'll see the patterns of leaves that comprise a tree. And I'm using pattern both in that way, so pattern describing the skirt of the figure, but also using pattern as a more freely roaming element in the work, kind of interwoven between the elements in the work. And when I developed the process for making the collage surface, I was thinking about trying to make a visual analogy to that patterning aspect of Indian miniature painting, but on a much larger scale. So in addition to collaging the patterned papers together, I also include in this work other independent bodies of drawings. So for example, the drawing on the upper left, this inverted head with the exaggeration of the hair becoming this kind of nest image. Excuse me. So this inversion of the head and exaggeration of the hair was something that I had made an entire body of work around from about 2007 to 2009. And this piece was written about in an exhibition catalog for a show titled War Baby Love Child, a mixed race Asian American artist. And I thought I would read for you what the curators wrote about this piece in the exhibition catalog. In her 2009 drawing Spark, Ahuja focuses on the constructed nature of her self-representation. The camera shutter release cable is clearly visible in her hand as she presents a mirrored self-portrait. Bowing deeply, arms thrust out, the sleeves of her Indian kameez open like bird wings. As her head swings down, she unleashes a mass of loose, curly hair. At the point in the drawing in which her doubled afro unites, a psychic explosion ignites. With uncontained hair and wearing a salwar kameez, Ahuja simultaneously signals Black power and Indian ethnicity. Nonetheless, the artist's refusal to face the viewer, evident in closed eyes and downturned head, forces Spark's audience to move from an easy reading of ascribed identity to focus on less tangible modes of mind and energy. As Ahuja summarizes, the flow of the head becomes a flow from the mind, a vehicle of infinite possibility. So in these hair-themed works, I was thinking about the history of Black hair as a barometer of social and political consciousness. For this work, I used a relatively simple process. I'm using the texture of the paper combined with my mark-making tool and this sort of small marks to create this large form. And this idea of making a large form with an accumulation of small marks is something that ties my works together. And I was inspired by an exhibition of Seurat drawings for this work, where Seurat was using the texture of the page to create the value and marks. So the hair-themed work was also about my own personal experience. You know, growing up as I did, I don't think there was a context for me to understand my looks or my hair as attractive. And it really wasn't until I was an adult and I consciously inserted myself into Black cultural spaces that I started to receive this different kind of feedback about who I am, about how I look, and specifically about my hair. And it created this kind of internal change. I started to feel differently about myself. And so this hair-themed work really was about this personal experience as well as connecting to a kind of larger history. And this was a work on canvas from that time. So also, another body of drawings that are embedded into a piece, the Mokunama, are these blue figures. And I developed these figures when I was an artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I was preparing for my our group final exhibition there, and I had made a number of pieces for that show. This was one of them. this was one of them. And I started to feel like something was missing. I was asking myself, what could be another view of this subject? Something maybe that gave the viewer a window into her psychological space, something that was a kind of alternate view. So I titled the series Dream Sequence after the cinematic idea of a dream sequence. So if you're watching a movie, there's a kind of visual world established. And then during a dream sequence, everything takes a kind of turn to the surreal. So I'm thinking about these works as a kind of daydreams, fantasies, or diversions of the subjects in my work. And you can see here the title, Ka's Hunting, referring again to the Jungle Book. So Ka's Hunting is one of the titles of the Jungle Book, and Ka is the snake in the Jungle Book. And after I finished the residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem, I continued to make these works, but on a larger scale. Throughout the work, am using a kind of winged figure theme and a bird theme. I was looking a lot at Assyrian reliefs, which have a lot of bird and winged figures. And I was then trying to create a diptych, two works that would go together. And I saw this piece at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And this gave me the idea for the paired works that I ended up making. This is one of them. And this is its partner piece. And so you can see here there's the beginning elements of a kind of minor collage and beginning of the stamping. So this was really where the collage drawings came out of this work. I started to ask myself, what if I built the whole page out of collage? So I originally made Mokunama for an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, and it was one of a trio of works. This was one of the other pieces in the show. And like Mokunama, having been a return to the imagery of that earlier piece, this too was a kind of thinking of the imagery in Generator, which I had made at the Studio Museum in Harlem. You can see that one of the things that I like to include in my self-portraits is my amblyopia, otherwise known as lazy eye. So you'll often see this kind of divergent gaze in my subjects, including here in Royal Ease. And you can see also here in Royal Ease the kind of many embedded drawings and fragments of drawings. And this piece was also part of that trio of works at the National Portrait Gallery. Here, again, the title Miku Moku refers to my nicknames. My father calls me Moku, and my aunt called me Miku. And you can see this kind of rhyming, playful words throughout the titling in my work. I was thinking here about a kind of self-competition, trying to kind of best oneself. So here, showing my subject fighting with herself. And then in Mokunama, also a double self-portrait, creating this victory. And here you can see the works installed at the Portrait Gallery. This is a kind of weird photograph using a wide angle lens, so it's creating a distortion, but you can kind of see the relationship between the parts. And then you can see that pair of dream sequence works that I made inspired by those earlier pieces that I saw at the Walters, and acting here as kind of guardians of this gallery space. So after making the works for the Portrait Gallery, which were actually the first collage drawings that I'd made, the works that I showed you earlier, the autocartography pieces, those actually came later. I started to ask myself how I might bring this process into works on canvas, into my oil paintings. So I made a series, the whole series is called Rhyme Sequence, and there's 5 works in the series. first what I'll do is just take you through the series, and then I'll come back and talk about the individual works. So again, this is first in the series, and I'm thinking about this as a kind of drawing state in the series. So it's a kind of simplified version of the landscape that I develop in the work. And I'm thinking about here these elements in this stage in a kind of nascent state. If you look at the patterns and papers that comprise the tree, here you can see that I've use those same patterns and papers to create this bundle by the foot of the figure. I'm thinking about these paper elements as a kind of raw material and putting them to use and then tweaking or turning that use from work to work. So that's where this idea of rhyme sequence, of creating a kind of visual rhyme, comes from. So I begin that work with a paper collage on the canvas. And here, very different, though, from the collage drawings I make, much more simplified version of that. And you can see here that I'm using the collage, the paper, to create these forms or objects in the space, as well as to using that patterning to basically obliterating the paper but retaining the patterning. So it's important to me that although my subject is alone in this space, that there's a sense of a culture there, and that culture is inscribed on her body. So this is an example of where I have obliterated the paper but retained the pattern into the final surface. So this piece is third in the series, and in some ways it's again like the first. It's kind of a more simplified version, more abstract. I often use blue in my work as a way to signal a kind of transformational potential. Oops. Sorry. And then here you can see that my figure is embodying a kind of transformation. And I'm thinking here about a kind of aftermath, after the end of the story, what remains kind of the kind of artifacts of a story. And those works, along with two of the pieces from the autocartography series, were exhibited together, and this will give you some sense of the scale of the works in a space. This is another one of the works in the state-of-the-art exhibition. And it's important to me that any information that the viewer needs to understand the work is in the work itself. So I often portray my subject with the remote shutter control that I use in the source material, the process of making the source material in my work. So even if you didn't know that these works were self-portraits, that tool will be a signal to you that my subject is controlling her own depiction, that I'm both in front of and behind the camera. And for this body of work, I was thinking about what, for me, might be a more straightforward self-portrait. So if I took away some of the more fantastical or mythic elements of my work, what would I have left? I'm still looking at a lot of different source material. I included this next piece because it represents a number of different things that are present in Indian art that relate to my work. So you can see this very flattened landscape with a sort of primary color background and this high horizon line relating to that last piece, the in-back garden piece. The double figure, the one figure standing on another figure here, Kali standing on Shiva, referring back to Mokunama, and also the blue-tinged figure referring to my, relating to my dream sequence works. So I'm, mining a lot of imagery for my own work. This is another piece in the Crystal Bridges State of the Art exhibition. I spent the past March and April as an artist in residence at the Siena Art Institute. And it was, when I said before that I've moved around a lot, it's primarily been to participate in different artist in residence programs, typically much longer programs. This was a shorter program, and it was also the first time I'd done a residency abroad, and it was my first time going to Italy. I was fairly daunted for a number of different reasons prior to going on the trip. One of the things I was concerned about is how I was going to make work there and how I was going to transport that work, because as you see, I like to work large. This was the painting I made just before going to Italy. So I decided that I would only make work that I could fit in my suitcase, and that I would bring all of the materials that I would need with me. So this is day one in Siena, and I've brought with me colored pencils and prepared paper for making drawings. One of the things that immediately struck me when I got to Italy was the ever-presence of the Romulus and Remus, the myth of the founding of Rome, where there's this idea that the founders Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf, which again tapped into my interest in the Jungle Book and that story, and also just my interest in cultural myth. So I knew that that imagery was going to be something that I was going to work with. This was the first drawing that I made in Italy. So Siena is a hilltop, medieval walled city, and I'm here just showing my encounter with the city of Siena and presenting this encounter with this imagery, the Romulus and Remus imagery, as central to that encounter. You can also see here that I'm including certain landmarks of Siena. So here on the left, that building on the left is the Palazzo Pubblico, the civic building in Siena. And then on the right is the Duomo, the main cathedral in Siena. So that piece was inspired by a work that I saw in the Pinacoteca, the pictures gallery in Siena. And prior to going to Italy, I really didn't know anything about Sienese painting. But I really loved the work in Siena. It's so interesting for bridging this kind of earlier Gothic style with the ideas that were coming out of Florence. But what I found so interesting about the work in Siena was that the use of space was much more, they were manipulating space to fit their narrative intentions. So rather than a kind of scientific approach to perspective, which was what I saw in the works in Florence, here there's a kind of more narrative-driven use of space. So you can see here there's this kind of recession in space, but the table is tipped up, and the figures at the back, because they're more important, they're a bit larger. So this was one of the things that most impacted me about going to Italy, this idea of how I think about space in a picture. So here I'm, as you can see, representing these figures that are farther away, larger, because they're the more important aspects of the scene. In this drawing, I'm bringing together statues that I saw in Rome and in Ostia into a kind of fictional museum space. And you can see that I'm depicting, again, the architecture such that you can see the interior and the exterior at the same time, which is a feature of Eastern art and also a feature of early Italian art. This is another work in the State of the Art exhibition. And here I'm portraying my subject in an inverse scale relationship to the Roman Forum. And relating this back to the idea of automythography, you know, my relationship to a place like the Roman Forum is as an outsider. But it's through the act of making a drawing like this that I gain a kind of agency in that space. And the way I think about it is that it becomes mine in a sense. I take it with me. I think that having limited materials in Siena actually really made a big impact on my work and the way that I think about making work. When I first got there, I felt frustrated to not be able to work large and to not be able to paint. But what happened in the time that I was there is that I forged a new relationship to materials that I've used for a long time. I started to draw more like I paint. So these sort of layering the material and creating a kind of texture in the work. I had never invested this kind of time in small works, and changing that fundamentally changed my drawings. I had brought this with me as a way to kind of remind myself of who I am as an artist, but I quickly found that the works in Siena were taking on a different character. So when I returned from Italy, I had like 3,000 photographs of things that I had seen, and I continued to make these drawings. So a couple of these that I've shown you, I actually made in Baltimore, having returned from Italy. And then when I returned to Baltimore and I again had all my materials in the studio, I brought some of this imagery into my collage drawings, so able to work large again. And here, like where I showed you in autocartography, the inclusion of handwriting as a kind of another pattern, another texture in the work, I'm including here text that I saw in Rome and in the Etruscan ruins. Here, just using the letters in kind of random order so that they're not spelling anything, they're more just another texture in the work. And then this is a very recent painting, also inspired by things that I saw in Italy. So you see often these kind of remnants of ancient brickwork. And I really was interested in this because it so perfectly marries my interest in pattern with image, right? It's like the pattern becomes the image. So this is something I want to deal with more. And this is what is freshest in my studio right now, influenced in part by my visit here last month to Crystal Bridges. So I'm thinking about the landscape here as a kind of metaphoric studio, and thinking about representing sort of the labor of art. So at the foot of the figure these are the building blocks of art, the building blocks of ideas. So I'm thinking about my subject a little bit differently now, more overtly as a picture of the artist. And I think the artist in our culture has a sort of mythic status. And here showing her in the process of creative invention amidst a landscape of ideas. So this brings you up to date with my work. I know I put a lot of information out there. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming.